I always thought Clara was the kind of woman who could light up a room just by stepping into it. Her laugh was this wild, untamed thing, loud and unapologetic, like she didn't care who heard. We'd been married 8 years, and I still felt that little jolt in my chest when she'd toss her dark curls back and grin at me over a glass of wine. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. 2 kids, a creaky house in the suburbs, and a rhythm we'd carved out together. I worked long hours at the auto shop, grease under my nails, while she managed the chaos of home. Or so I thought. Started with the phone. Clara had always been careless with it, leaving it on the counter, screen up, buzzing with notifications from her book club or the kids' school. One night, I was wiping down the kitchen after dinner, the kids already tucked in, when her phone lit up. A name I didn't recognize, Elliot. No last name, just Elliot, followed by a message that slid across the screen before it dimmed. Missed you today. My stomach twisted. Not because it was anything damning, but because it was off. She didn't know an Elliot. At least she'd never mentioned one. I didn't say anything that night. Clara was in the shower, humming some old song, and I just stood there, staring at the phone like it was a grenade. I could have unlocked it. She used the same PIN as our bank card, 0513, our anniversary, but something stopped me. Maybe it was trust. Maybe it was fear. Instead, I poured myself a whiskey and sat on the couch, replaying every moment of the last few months in my head. Had she been distant? Had she been too happy? Couldn't tell. The next morning, she kissed me goodbye like always, her lips soft against mine, and I drove to work with that name, Elliot, burning a hole in my brain. Days turned into weeks, and I became a man obsessed. I didn't confront her, didn't ask. I watched. She started leaving the house more. Errands, she said. Grocery runs that took 3 hours. Coffee with friends I'd never met. Her phone was suddenly password protected, and she'd angle it away when she typed, her fingers quick and secretive. I'd catch her smiling at it, a small, private curve of her lips, and my chest would tighten. I wasn't a fool. I knew something was wrong, but knowing and proving are 2 different beasts. One Tuesday I followed her, took the day off, told the shop I was sick, and tailed her beat-up Honda through town. She didn't go to the store, didn't meet a friend. She parked outside a little diner on the edge of the city, one of those retro places with neon signs and chipped paint. I stayed back, engine off, watching through the windshield as she stepped out, her sundress swaying in the breeze. A man met her at the door, tall, lean, with sharp cheekbones and a leather jacket. Elliot, I assumed. They didn't hug, didn't touch, but the way she looked at him, it was like I didn't exist anymore. I didn't storm into the diner that day. I wanted to, I wanted to ram my fist through something, anything. But I sat there, hands shaking on the steering wheel, until they disappeared inside. My mind spun wild scenarios. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe he was a cousin, a coworker, a nobody. But the way her eyes lingered on him, soft and unguarded, told me it wasn't nothing. I drove home, knuckles white, and waited for her to come back with some flimsy excuse. She did, 3 hours later, carrying a single grocery bag with a loaf of bread and a jar of jam. Traffic was a nightmare, she said, brushing past me to the kitchen. I nodded, mute, tasting bile. From then on, I turned into someone I didn't recognize. I started checking her car's mileage, small increases that didn't match her stories. I'd linger by the bedroom door when she thought I was asleep, listening to the faint tap-tap of her texting. Once, I even fished a receipt out of her purse. Coffee for 2, paid in cash, from that same diner. Each clue was a splinter under my skin, sharp and festering. I didn't confront her because I needed more. I needed to know how deep this went, how far she'd fallen from the woman I'd vowed to love. Elliot wasn't hard to find. A quick search on her laptop, left open one night while she bathed, revealed an email thread buried in her spam folder. E. Carver. The signature read, Elliot Carver. A photographer, apparently, with a website full of artsy black and white shots, portraits, landscapes, and, buried in a password-protected gallery, a single photo of Clara. She was laughing, head thrown back, sunlight catching her hair. It was dated 3 months ago. My wife, my Clara, immortalized by this stranger's lens. The intimacy of it, the way he'd captured her, made my vision blur with something hot and ugly. I started tailing her more, piecing together their routine. Tuesdays and Thursdays, always the diner, always 2 hours. Sometimes they'd leave together, her car following his sleek black sedan to a motel off Route 17. They'd go in separate, her slipping through the side door like a ghost, him striding in bold as brass. I never followed them inside. Couldn't. The thought of seeing it, of hearing it, would have broken something in me I couldn't fix. Instead, I'd sit in my truck, chain-smoking, letting the rage build like a storm. Clara didn't suspect a thing. At home, she was the same, warm, playful, curling up beside me on the couch with a bowl of popcorn like nothing had changed. She'd ask about my day, tease me about the grease stains on my jeans, and I'd force a smile, wondering how she could lie so easily. The kids were oblivious, too. Tommy with his toy cars, Lily with her crayons. Our life looked perfect from the outside, a little family tableau, but inside, I was rotting. Every touch, every laugh, felt like a mockery now. She was slipping away, and I was the fool holding the rope. The first time I saw them together outside that motel, something snapped. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, cold break deep in my chest. They came out of room 12, her hair mussed, his jacket slung over one shoulder. She glanced around, nervous, while he lit a cigarette, casual as you please. They didn't kiss goodbye, didn't linger, but the space between them crackled with something unspoken. I watched from across the lot, hidden behind tinted windows, and realized this wasn't some fling. This was a rhythm, a habit. My wife had built a whole other life, and I wasn't in it. I started digging deeper. Elliot Carver wasn't just a photographer. He had a studio downtown, a loft apartment above it, and a reputation. I found his ex-profile, full of cryptic posts about muses and fleeting moments, alongside photos of half-dressed models draped in shadows. One post, dated a week ago, showed a silhouette that could have been Clara. Curved hips, wild hair, captioned, "She's my chaos." My hands shook as I scrolled, each image a knife twist. He wasn't some random guy, he was an artist, and she was his obsession. At home, I played the part. Made dinner, helped with homework, kissed her goodnight. But my mind was elsewhere, plotting. I needed evidence, something concrete, something she couldn't deny. I bought a tiny camera online, the kind you hide in a smoke detector, and rigged it up in our living room. Another went in the bedroom, angled at her side of the bed. I wasn't proud of it, but pride was long gone. The footage was mundane at first, her folding laundry, singing off-key. But then came the calls. Late at night, when she thought I was asleep, she'd whisper into the phone, voice low and husky. Words I couldn't make out but didn't need to. She'd smile, twirl her hair, and hang up with a sigh that wasn't for me. I tracked Elliot's movements, too. His studio was a revolving door of clients. Mostly women, some men, all artsy types with too much money and too little sense. I parked outside one evening, watching through binoculars as Clara slipped in the back. She stayed an hour, emerged flushed and laughing, his hand brushing her waist as he locked up. They didn't see me, didn't know I was there, cataloging every second. I started keeping a notebook, dates, times, places, building a case like some deranged detective. It wasn't enough to know. I had to prove it, to see it all laid bare. The kids started asking questions. "Why's Daddy so quiet?" Lily said one night, her big eyes on me over her plate of spaghetti. Clara laughed it off, ruffling her hair, but her glance flicked to me, sharp and searching. I shrugged, muttered something about work, and she let it drop. She was good at that, deflecting, smoothing over cracks. But the cracks were widening, and I was done pretending. I didn't know what I'd do with all this yet. Confront her, leave her, destroy her. But the weight of it was crushing me, and I needed a release. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday. I'd called in sick again, told Clara I'd be home late, and followed her to the motel. This time, I didn't stay in the truck. I waited until they were inside, then crept up to the window, the curtains parted just enough to see. It wasn't what I expected. Not the frantic, messy tangle I'd imagined. They were slow, deliberate, her hands tracing his face like she was memorizing it, his fingers threading through her hair with a tenderness that gutted me. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, intimate in a way we hadn't been in years. I stumbled back, rain soaking my shirt, and vomited into the bushes. That night, I didn't go home. I checked into a cheap motel across town, lay on a lumpy mattress, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. My phone buzzed. Clara, asking where I was, her voice on the voicemail bright and fake. I didn't answer, couldn't. The image of them together burned behind my eyes, and with it came a clarity I hadn't felt before. This wasn't about saving us anymore. It was about making her pay. Not with yelling or tears, that was too easy. I wanted something sharper, something that had cut deeper than she'd ever cut me. I started planning. Elliot was the key. He was vain, public, a man who lived for attention. I'd used that. I went back to his ex-profile, downloaded every post, every photo, and cross-referenced them with Clara's outings. Patterns emerged, dates that matched her errands, locations she'd mentioned in passing. I hacked into his website's client portal. His password was laughably simple, Shadowlight, and found a folder labeled C. Dozens of pictures of her, some candid, some posed, all glowing with a love I hadn't seen in her eyes for me in ages. One showed her in lingerie I didn't recognize, sprawled on a velvet couch, his signature scrawled in the corner. I didn't stop there. I tailed him to a bar one night, watched him flirt with a waitress while Clara was home with the kids. He was a player, I realized, not just with her, but with others. That was my angle. If Clara thought she was special, I'd show her she was just another notch. I started collecting receipts from his dates, blurry photos of him with other women, timestamps that overlapped with her visits. It wasn't enough to ruin him. I needed to ruin them, to shatter whatever fantasy they'd built. Back home, I kept up the charade. Clara noticed I was off, asked if I was okay, her brow furrowed with concern that felt like a slap. I said I was tired, stressed, and she bought it, wrapping her arms around me like she still cared. I let her, but my mind was elsewhere, spinning through options. Divorce was too clean. Exposure was too quick. I wanted something slow, something that'd unravel her piece by piece until she couldn't look at herself, or him, without feeling the weight of what she'd done. The plan took shape over weeks, a dark thread weaving through my days. I stopped tailing them, knew their routine well enough by now, and focused on the endgame. Elliot's ego was my weapon. Clara's trust was my leverage. I opened a fake X account, Shadow Chaser, and started posting cryptic messages. Quotes about betrayal, blurry shots of the motel. Nothing direct, but enough to stir curiosity. I tagged him in a few, watched his followers speculate. He didn't respond, but I saw him check the account late one night, his face lit by his phone screen outside his studio. Good. Let him sweat. Next, I printed the photos from his C folder, not all, just a select few. Her in that lingerie, her laughing by a window, her hand on his chest. I mailed them anonymously to his loft. No note, just the images in a plain envelope. Then I waited. 2 days later, Clara came home rattled, her eyes darting as she dumped her purse on the counter. Something weird happened, she said, voice tight. Someone sent Elliot pictures of me. I feigned shock, asked questions, let her spill it. He'd called her furious, accusing her of jealousy or sabotage. She denied it, but the seed was planted. I kept pushing. Sent more photos to his clients, his bar buddies, each envelope a little time bomb. His ex-posts grew frantic, defensive, ranting about stalkers and privacy. His reputation started to crack. Cancellations rolled in, whispers spread. Clara noticed, too. She'd pace the house, chewing her nails, muttering about some psycho ruining his life. I'd nod, sympathetic, while inside I burned with a cold, quiet glee. She didn't suspect me, not yet. I was too careful, too invisible. Then I upped the ante. I forged a letter from Elliot to Clara, mimicked his pretentious style from his posts, saying he was done, that she was too needy, that he'd found someone else. I left it in her car, half tucked under the seat where she'd find it. She did, that Friday and came home crying, locking herself in the bathroom. I heard her sobbing through the door, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry. Almost. But then I remembered her in that motel room, and the pity turned to ash. By now, Elliot was a mess, paranoid, lashing out online, losing gigs. Clara was fraying too, snapping at the kids, avoiding my eyes. I'd torn their little world apart without firing a shot. And this was just the start. The real revenge, the cruelest part, was still coming. I'd make her see him for what he was, make her feel every ounce of the shame she'd buried. And when she had nothing left to cling to, I'd walk away, leaving her to drown in it. Clara's unraveling was a slow, beautiful thing to watch. After finding that forged letter in her car, she stopped pretending everything was fine. She'd sit at the kitchen table, staring into space, her coffee going cold in her hands. The kids noticed. Tommy asked why Mommy was sad, and she'd snap out of it long enough to force a smile, but it never reached her eyes. I played the concerned husband, asking gentle questions she dodged with mumbles about stress. She didn't know I'd orchestrated it, didn't know I was the storm tearing through her life. That ignorance made it sweeter. Elliot, meanwhile, was spiraling. His ex-account became a battlefield, angry rants about haters, vague apologies to unnamed muses, then silence as his followers dwindled. I'd struck gold with those mailed photos. His clients didn't like the whiff of scandal, and his bar buddies started distancing themselves. I kept the pressure on, leaking a few more images to local art forums, nothing too obvious, just enough to fuel rumors. A grainy shot of him with a blonde at the motel, timestamped the same day he'd met Clara. Let her wonder who else he was chasing. I didn't stop there. I hacked his email again. Same weak password, the idiot, and found a thread with Clara, buried in his drafts. Unsent but damning. "You're too much sometimes," he'd written, always needing reassurance. "I can't breathe with you." I polished it up, made it nastier, and sent it from his account to her inbox while she slept beside me. The next morning, she checked her phone at breakfast and went pale, fork clattering to her plate. "You okay?" I asked, all innocence. She nodded, lips tight, and excused herself. I heard the bathroom door lock, then the muffled sound of her crying again. She tried calling him. I saw the outgoing logs on our phone bill, but he didn't pick up. I'd already blocked her number from his line using a spoofing app, a trick I'd learned from a shady mechanic at the shop. She'd leave voicemails, her voice cracking, begging him to explain. He'd never hear them, and she'd never know why. The silence was my weapon, driving a wedge between them deeper than any words could. She started doubting herself, doubting him, and I watched it eat her alive. At home, the tension thickened. She'd flinch when I touched her, like she was guilty of something she couldn't name. I kept up the act. Cooked dinner, read to the kids, asked about her day. But my eyes were cold, and she felt it. One night, she broke, sobbing into her pillow while I pretended to sleep. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered, thinking I couldn't hear. "I don't know who I am anymore." I lay still, heart pounding, savoring every tear. This was only the beginning. The next phase was about exposure. Not to me, not yet, but to the world she thought she could hide in. I started with her book club, that little circle of women she'd always bragged about. I printed a collage of Elliot's photos, Clara in that lingerie, Clara laughing with him, and mailed it anonymously to the group's organizer, a nosy woman named Beth. No note, just the images and a diner receipt stapled on. Within days, Clara's phone buzzed with texts she wouldn't answer. She came home from a meeting red-eyed, claiming she'd quit the club. "They're all gossips," she muttered. I nodded, hiding my smirk. Elliot's downfall accelerated, too. I'd found his landlord's contact in a public record and sent an envelope. More photos. A forged complaint about immoral activity in the studio. The lease was month to month. A week later, I drove by and saw him loading boxes into his sedan, his jaw tight with fury. He'd lost his space, his sanctuary, and I knew Clara would feel it. She drove by the studio herself one evening. I'd followed at a distance, and sat in her car, staring at the for rent sign, hands gripping the wheel. She didn't cry this time. She just looked empty. I kept twisting the knife. Using Shadow Chaser, I posted a thread on X, a fictional confession from a woman scorned by Elliot, complete with details only Clara would recognize. The diner, the motel, the velvet couch. I tagged him, let it spread. She saw it. I caught her scrolling late one night, her face lit blue by the screen, lips trembling. She didn't confront him. She couldn't. He'd gone quiet, offline, retreating from the mess I'd made of his life. She was alone now, clinging to a ghost. The kids were my shield. I poured myself into them. Took them to the park, built a fort in the living room, while Clara drifted through the house like a shadow. She'd try to join us, but her heart wasn't in it, and they felt it. Lily stopped asking her to play. Tommy clung to me instead. She noticed, and it broke her a little more each day. I didn't comfort her, didn't bridge the gap. I let her sink, let her feel the weight of losing us, too. One night, she cornered me. "Are we okay?" she asked, voice small, standing in the kitchen doorway. Her eyes were desperate, searching mine. I could have ended it there, told her I knew, watched her crumble, but that was too quick. "Yeah," I said, flat and unconvincing. "Just tired." She nodded, unconvinced, and walked away. I poured another whiskey and planned the next move. She wasn't broken enough yet. Not nearly enough. I decided to hit her where it hurt most. Her pride. Clara had always cared what people thought. Her perfect little life, her perfect little family. I stripped that away. I started small, spreading whispers through the neighborhood. A casual chat with our next-door neighbor, Jim, about how Clara's been distracted lately, always out. A vague comment to the school moms about her new friend, who takes up so much of her time. Nothing concrete, just enough to plant seeds. Soon, I'd catch their sidelong glances at her during pickup, hear the murmurs when she walked by. Then I went bigger. I forged a letter from Elliot again, this time to her boss at the library where she worked part-time. "Clara's been my muse," it read, "but she's getting clingy. Maybe you can talk some sense into her." I included a photo, her in that lingerie, and mailed it. She came home the next day, ashen, saying she'd been let go for personal issues. She wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't explain. I acted surprised, pressed her gently, and watched her squirm as she lied about budget cuts. The shame was delicious. Elliot was a shell now. I tracked him to a dive bar across town. He'd lost the loft, the studio, everything but that sedan. I sent a tip to a local gossip blog, photographer Elliot Carver's Fall from Grace, with blurry shots of him stumbling out drunk. They ran it, and it spread. Clara saw it. I left the tab open on her laptop, and she locked herself in the bedroom for hours. When she emerged, her eyes were hollow, her voice flat. "He's not who I thought," she said, more to herself than me. I shrugged, said nothing. She didn't deserve my words. I kept the pressure on her, too. Slipped a note under her windshield wiper. "I know who you really are," and watched her find it, panic flickering across her face. She didn't tell me, didn't tell anyone. She was unraveling alone, just as I'd planned. The kids pulled away more, sensing her distance, her fragility, and she couldn't bridge it. I'd catch her staring at old family photos, tears streaking her cheeks, and I'd feel a dark satisfaction. She was losing everything piece by piece. That night, she tried to reach out, curled up beside me on the couch, her hand tentative on my arm. "I miss us," she whispered. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman I'd loved, the woman who'd betrayed me. "Me too," I said, voice cold, and pulled away. She flinched, and I knew I'd landed another blow. The real revenge was close now. I could taste it. The kids were my next move, not to hurt them, never that, but to widen the chasm between her and them. I started taking them out more, weekend trips to the zoo, late-night ice cream runs, without her. I'd tell her it was spur of the moment, that they'd begged to go, but the truth was I wanted her to feel their absence. She'd watch us leave, standing at the door with a forced smile, and when we came back, the house felt colder. Lily stopped asking for her bedtime stories. Tommy clung to me at night. Clara noticed, and it carved lines into her face. I escalated with Elliot. He'd moved into a cheap rental, a dump on the edge of town, and I found his new number through a mutual contact. I sent him texts from a burner, taunts, half-truths. "She's telling everyone you used her. She's got a new guy already." He didn't reply, but I saw him at the bar again, hunched over a bottle, paranoia in his eyes. Then I mailed him a final blow, a forged letter from Clara, cold and cutting, saying she'd never loved him, that he was a mistake. I wanted him to hate her as much as I did. Clara felt it, too. She'd try calling him. I'd unblocked her number now, let her through, and he'd ignore her, thanks to that letter. She'd leave voicemails, her voice breaking, until one day she stopped, came home and sat on the couch, staring at nothing. "He's gone," she said flat. I didn't respond, just watched her crumble. The neighborhood whispers had grown louder. Jim asked me outright if something was up with her, and I shrugged, let him draw his own conclusions. She'd lost her job, her friends, her lover, and now her family's warmth. She was a ghost in her own life. I started leaving clues for her to find. Not enough to expose me, but enough to unnerve her. A diner receipt on the counter, dated one of their Tuesdays. A motel keycard slipped into her coat pocket. She'd find them, freeze, and say nothing, but her hands would shake. She was starting to suspect something, though not me. Not yet. I wanted her to feel watched, hunted, like she'd never escape what she'd done. One night, she asked, "Do you think someone knows?" Her voice was small, scared. "Knows what?" I said, neutral. She didn't answer, just turned away. The final piece was forming in my mind. I'd take everything she had left, her dignity, her sanity, and leave her with nothing but the wreckage. I bought a burner phone, recorded a message in a distorted voice. "You can't hide what you are." Sent it to her at midnight. She jolted awake beside me, fumbled for her phone, and played it, her breathing ragged. "What's that?" I mumbled, feigning sleepiness. "Nothing," she lied, and curled into herself. I smiled into the dark. She was almost there, right where I wanted her. By now, Clara was a shadow of herself. She'd lost weight, her cheeks hollow, her hair limp. She'd wander the house in silence, avoiding mirrors, avoiding me. The kids barely noticed her anymore. Lily called me her favorite one night, and Clara flinched like she'd been slapped. I didn't soothe her, didn't soften the blow. I wanted her to feel every inch of that rejection, to know she'd pushed them away with her lies. She'd try to engage them, offer games or snacks, but they'd turn to me instead, and she'd retreat, defeated. Elliot was finished. The gossip blog had done its work. His name was mud in the art world, his clients gone, his pride shattered. I drove by his rental one last time, saw the sedan packed with bags. He was leaving town, running from the mess I'd made. I sent Clara a final text from his number. Spoofed, of course. "Don't ever contact me again. You ruined me." She read it in the kitchen, dropped her phone, and sank to the floor, hands over her face. I walked in, acted concerned. "What's wrong?" She shook her head, mute, and I left her there, broken. The neighborhood turned on her next. Beth from the book club had spread the photos. I heard it from Jim's wife, who clucked about poor Clara with fake pity. People stared when she picked up the kids, whispered when she shopped. She stopped going out unless she had to, hiding behind sunglasses and a scarf. I fueled it, dropped hints to the school moms about trouble at home. Let them fill in the blanks. She'd come home from those rare outings pale and silent, the weight of their judgment crushing her. I pushed her further, left more notes. "You're nothing now. Everyone sees through you." Tucked into her purse, her car, her dresser. She stopped sleeping, started pacing at night, muttering to herself. Once, she woke me, shaking, saying she'd heard footsteps outside. "It's just the wind," I said, calm, knowing I'd been the one tapping the window. She was paranoid, fragile, and I reveled in it. She'd lost her lover, her job, her friends, her kids' love. Now her mind was slipping too. The end was near. I'd saved the cruelest part for last. A finale that'd leave her with nothing but regret. I started packing my things. Not much, just enough to signal a shift. She noticed, asked in a trembling voice, "Are you going somewhere?" I looked at her, cold and steady. "Maybe," I said. "I need to think." Her eyes widened, panic flaring, but she didn't push. She knew she'd lost me, even if she didn't know how. I wasn't done yet. Not until she begged. Not until she broke completely. Clara's collapse was almost complete, but I wasn't satisfied yet. She'd lost so much. Elliot, her job, her friends, her kids' affection. But she still had one thing. The illusion of our marriage. I take that, too, and make it hurt. I started staying out late, claiming work emergencies at the shop. She'd wait up, eyes red, asking quiet questions I'd brush off with a shrug. "Don't worry about it," I'd say, watching her shrink. I wasn't at the shop. I'd sit in my truck by the river, smoking, planning. But she didn't need to know that. The uncertainty was enough. I planted more traps. Left a lipstick-stained napkin in my jacket pocket. Bought cheap from a drugstore, smeared it myself, and let her find it while doing laundry. She didn't ask, just held it up with trembling fingers, her face a mask of dread. I acted oblivious, said it must have been from a client's car, but the doubt festered. Then I accidentally left my phone unlocked. A fake text thread open from Jen, a coworker who didn't exist. "Last night was fun," it read. Clara saw it, went still, and didn't speak to me for hours. I wanted her to think I'd moved on, that she wasn't even worth my loyalty anymore. The kids were my silent allies. I'd take them to stay with my sister some nights, telling Clara they needed a break. She'd nod, hollow-eyed, and watch us go. When we returned, they'd chatter about Aunt Meg's cookies, oblivious to their mother's absence from the story. Clara tried harder with them. Baked their favorite muffins once, voice bright and brittle, but they barely thanked her, running to me instead. I saw the pain in her eyes, the realization she'd lost them, and I let it sink in deep. I kept up the psychological games. Left voicemails on her phone from that burner. Whispered threats like, "You'll pay for what you did." Distorted and chilling. She'd play them, delete them, never tell me, but I'd catch her jumping at shadows, checking locks twice. One night, I rearranged the living room furniture while she slept, just slightly, couch an inch off, lamp tilted. She woke up, frowned, and spent the day pacing, muttering about something wrong. She was cracking, and I was the invisible hammer. The final push came when I staged a fight. I waited for a quiet evening, kids asleep, and picked at her. Small jabs about her distance, her mood. "You're not even here anymore," I said, voice sharp. She flinched, tried to explain, but I cut her off. "I don't know who you are, Clara." She cried, begged me to stay, but I grabbed my keys and left, driving to a motel for the night. Let her stew in it. Let her think I was done. I wasn't, not yet. The real end was coming, and it'd be worse than she could imagine. I stayed gone 2 days, long enough for her to panic. She blew up my phone. Texts, calls, voicemails pleading for me to come home. "I'm sorry," she said, voice breaking. "Whatever I did, I'm sorry." She didn't know what she was apologizing for. Not really. But I let her grovel. When I walked back in, she threw her arms around me, sobbing into my chest. I stood stiff, didn't hug back, and her grip loosened, confusion in her eyes. "We need to talk," I said, cold as stone, and sat her down. I didn't reveal everything, not yet. I started vague, said I'd heard things, that people were talking about her. Her face drained of color, hands twisting in her lap. "What things?" she whispered. I shrugged, let the silence stretch, then dropped a bomb. "Someone sent me pictures. Not true, not mailed to me anyway, but I'd kept copies of Elliot's shots." I slid one across the table, her in that lingerie, and watched her gasp, eyes wide with horror. "Where did you get that?" she stammered. "Doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is you lied." She tried to explain, stumbled over half-truths about a friend, a mistake, but I cut her off. "I don't want excuses. I want to know why." She couldn't answer, just cried, and I let her drown in it. I didn't yell, didn't raise my voice, just stared, unblinking, until she begged me to stop. "I'll fix it," she said, clutching my hand. "I'll do anything." I pulled away, stood up. "I need time," I lied, and walked out again. She didn't follow. She was too broken to chase me now. I spent that night at the shop, plotting the endgame. She thought this was the worst. Me knowing, me pulling away, but I had more. I'd take her dignity, her home, her everything, and leave her with nothing but the wreckage. I started moving money, small amounts from our joint account to a new one she didn't know about. Sold some tools, pocketed the cash. She wouldn't notice, not yet. She was too lost in her guilt. I wanted her destitute, dependent, before I delivered the final blow. When I went home, she was a wreck. Hair unwashed, eyes swollen. The kids were at school, and she tried to clean, but the house smelled of desperation. She hovered, asking if I'd stay, if we could work it out. I didn't answer, just unpacked my bag slow, deliberate, letting her hope. That hope was my trap. She'd cling to it and I'd rip it away. The cruelest revenge wasn't leaving her yet. It was making her think she could save this, then proving she couldn't. I let her dangle in that false hope for a week. Played the part, ate dinner with her, nodded at her small talk, but kept my distance, my touches rare and cold. She'd reach for me, hesitant, and I'd pull back just enough to sting. The kids sensed it too, stayed quiet, stuck to me like glue. Clara tried harder, cooked my favorite meals, wore dresses she thought I liked, but it was pathetic, a performance for a man who'd already checked out. She didn't see the storm coming. I finalized my preparations, rented a small apartment across town, paid cash, kept it secret. Moved more money, half our savings now, into that hidden account. I packed a bag for me and the kids, stashed it in my truck. She'd wake up one day to an empty house. No note, no explanation, just gone. But first, I'd strip her bare. I gathered every piece of evidence, photos, receipts, that motel keycard, and made copies. One set for her, one for me, one for the world if I chose. She'd face it all, no escape. The night before I sprang it, I set the stage. Left the bedroom camera running. She didn't know it was there and waited. She sat on the bed, phone in hand, staring at Elliot's last text, the one I'd faked. She whispered his name, a broken sound, and I caught it all on tape. Then I walked in, casual, and she jumped, hiding the phone. "What are you doing?" I asked, neutral. "Nothing," she lied, and I let it slide. That footage was gold, her guilt, preserved forever. Next morning, I sent the kids to school and called her to the living room. She shuffled in, nervous, clutching a mug. I laid it out. Not everything, just enough. "I know about him," I said, tossing the lingerie photo on the coffee table. She froze, mug slipping, tea spilling across the floor. "I know where you went, what you did." She stammered, denied, then begged, falling to her knees. "Please don't leave me," she sobbed. I crouched, looked her in the eye. "You don't get to ask that," I said, and stood. She wailed, clutching my leg, but I shook her off. I didn't leave then, wanted her to stew. Went to work, came back late, and found her curled on the couch, eyes vacant. She didn't speak, just watched me move through the house like a stranger. I slept in the guest room, locked the door, let her feel the walls closing in. The end was hours away, and she had no idea how bad it'd get. I'd take everything she loved, everything she was, and leave her to rot in the ashes. The morning of the end, I moved fast. Kids were up early. I fed them, packed their bags, told them we were going on a trip. They cheered, oblivious, while Clara hovered, confused. "Where are you taking them?" she asked, voice thin. "Out," I said, sharp, and she backed off, sensing the ice in me. I loaded them into the truck, drove to my sister's, and dropped them off. "Keep them a few days," I told Meg, who nodded, no questions. She'd heard enough from me to know Clara was done. Back home, Clara was waiting, pacing the kitchen. I didn't ease into it. Walked in, dropped my keys, and said, "We're finished." She blinked, like she hadn't heard right, then rushed me, words tumbling out. "No, we can fix this, I'll change." I cut her off, threw the stack of photos on the counter. Every shot of her with Elliot, every lie exposed. She stared, mouth open, then sank to the floor, shaking her head. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "Long enough," I said, and pulled out the final piece. I played the bedroom footage on my phone, her whispering his name, her guilt in high definition. She gasped, hands flying to her mouth, and I let it loop, her voice echoing in the silence. "You filmed me?" she choked out. "Had to," I said, cold. "You wouldn't tell me the truth." She lunged for the phone, but I yanked it back, towering over her. "You don't touch me anymore," I snapped, and she crumpled, sobbing. I wasn't done, handed her an envelope, the last of my evidence. "This is yours. Keep it. Remember it." I packed while she cried, clothes, tools, a few keepsakes from the kids. She followed me, begging, promising, but I ignored her, methodical, stripping the house of me. Then I hit her with the money. "Half's gone. You'll figure out the rest." Her eyes widened, our savings, her safety net, vanished. She screamed, clawed at me, but I pushed past, grabbed my bag, and walked out. She collapsed on the porch, wailing my name, but I didn't look back. The truck roared to life and I was free. I didn't stop there. Drove to the post office, mailed copies of those photos, her with Elliot, her in shame, to her parents, her sister, the school moms. Labeled them Clara's Truth. No return address. Let them see her for what she was. By nightfall, her phone would light up with their shock, their disgust, and she'd have nowhere to hide. I checked into my apartment, cracked a beer, and waited for the fallout. She'd feel it all. The loss, the judgment, the ruin, and I'd be gone untouchable. The aftermath was chaos, just as I'd planned. My sister called that night. Clara had shown up at her place, hysterical, begging to see the kids. Meg turned her away, said they were busy, and Clara left sobbing. Her parents rang me next, furious, demanding answers. I told them flat, she chose someone else. Ask her. They hung up, stunned, and I knew they'd tear into her. The school moms texted me screenshots. Clara's sister had posted the photos online. A public shaming, captioned, "Family Secrets." Clara's world was burning and I'd lit the match. I settled into my new life. The apartment was small, bare, but mine. The kids came to stay, adjusted fast. Lily asked once where Mommy was, and I said, "She's figuring things out." They didn't push, happy with me, and I made sure they were. Clara tried calling, left voicemails I deleted unheard. She showed up at the shop once, gaunt and desperate, but I had a coworker send her off. "Tell her I'm not here," I said, and watched from the back as she stumbled away, defeated. Word spread. She'd lost the house within a month, couldn't pay the mortgage with half the savings gone and no job. Moved in with her sister, who barely tolerated her after the scandal. The neighborhood shunned her, the kids' school whispered about her, and Elliot was long gone, a footnote in her ruin. I heard she tried therapy, tried begging forgiveness from anyone who'd listen, but no one cared. She was alone, stripped of everything. Her family, her pride, her identity. I didn't gloat, didn't need to. The revenge wasn't in crowing. It was in knowing she'd wake up every day to the wreckage I'd left her in. I'd taken her life apart, piece by piece, and walked away whole. The kids thrived with me. The shop kept me busy, and Clara faded into a memory I didn't bother revisiting. One night, I burned the last photo of her laughing with him, and watched it curl to ash. She'd betrayed me in a way I'd never forgive, and I'd made her pay in a way she'd never forget. That was enough. Years later, I heard she'd moved away, a shadow of herself, living off scraps of charity. I didn't care enough to check. My life was mine again. Clean, quiet, complete. She'd gambled on a fantasy and lost everything to my reality. And me? I slept just fine.